No attorney, the judge asked me. The courtroom smelled like old paper-burnt coffee and floor polish. It was one of those county courtrooms that hadn't changed much since the 1980s. Brown wooden benches, buzzing fluorescent lights, an old American flag standing beside the judge's bench. My younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. She can't afford one. A couple people in the gallery smirked. My father nodded proudly beside him like Daniel had just said something clever. I stood alone at the defense table wearing an old beige coat I'd bought years ago in Norfolk after my husband died. I could feel every eye in that room studying me, judging me. A 63-year-old widow with gray streaks in her hair and no lawyer. Easy target. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at me again. Ma'am, this is a serious civil proceeding involving inheritance fraud allegations. Are you certain you wish to represent yourself? Daniel chuckled under his breath. She always was stubborn. I looked at my brother for a long moment. Funny how age changes faces but not character. Daniel was 58 now. His hair was thinner, his stomach heavier, but the smug little grin he wore when we were children was still there. The same grin he wore after blaming me for breaking Dad's fishing radio when he'd done it himself. The same grin he wore after stealing money from Mom's purse in high school. The same grin he wore now. I slowly removed my coat and folded it neatly over the table. Then I looked directly at their attorney. Who signed your security clearance? The courtroom went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Their attorney stopped breathing for a second. The color drained from his face so fast I actually thought he might faint. The judge noticed immediately. Mr. Talbot, he asked carefully. Daniel looked confused. What the hell does that even mean? He laughed. But his attorney wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at me with the exact same expression I'd seen on young naval officers years ago when they accidentally opened the wrong classified file. Fear mixed with recognition. I sat down calmly. And for the first time that morning, nobody in that courtroom looked at me like a helpless old woman. Not even my father. 3 months earlier, I had been standing in my kitchen overlooking the Chesapeake Bay when the lawsuit papers arrived. Rain tapped against the windows that afternoon. The kind of slow Virginia rain that settles into your bones. I remember heating tomato soup on the stove when the mail carrier knocked. Certified envelope. County seal. Inside was a lawsuit filed by my own brother accusing me of manipulating our late mother into changing her will while she suffered from dementia. I must have read the papers 6 times. My hands didn't even shake at first. That came later. After 40 years working around military investigations, you learn to stay calm during shock. Your body delays the reaction until it's alone. I sat at my kitchen table until sunset, staring at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the complaint. My own brother. The boy whose diapers I changed when Mom worked late shifts at the diner. The teenager I covered for after he got drunk and wrapped Dad's truck around a mailbox in 1983. The grown man I loaned nearly $30,000 to over the years without ever asking for repayment. Now he wanted me destroyed in court. The strangest part wasn't even the lawsuit. It was my father supporting him. That hurt worse. Dad was 86 now. Arthritis in both hands, heart trouble, hearing aid in his left ear. After Mom passed, Daniel practically moved into his house full-time. At first I thought it was kindness, then I realized it was control. Dad stopped answering my calls regularly. When I visited, Daniel somehow always managed to be there, and every conversation became uncomfortable. You sure stayed gone a long time, Dad told me once while staring at the television instead of me. I'd stood there holding grocery bags in both hands like some unwanted guest. I was serving Dad. That was all he said. 40 years reduced to The truth is, my father never forgave me for joining the Navy. Not really. He came from an older generation, Korean War generation, men who believed daughters stayed close to home. My mother understood me. Dad never did. When I enlisted in 1979, he acted like I'd abandoned the family. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in Virginia close to home, close to Dad. That made him the good son. Didn't matter how many failed businesses he started. Didn't matter how much money disappeared over the years. Didn't matter how many lies Mom quietly covered for. He stayed. And in my father's mind, staying counted more than sacrifice. After my husband Frank died from pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, I finally retired from naval intelligence logistics consulting and came home for good. Not to fight. Not to prove anything. I just got tired of hotel rooms, government buildings, and lonely mornings. I thought maybe at 63 family mattered more than old resentments. I was wrong. The first sign came during Mom's final year alive. She started calling me late at night. Not emotional calls. Careful ones. Quiet. Daniel's handling the finances now, she whispered once. I remember sitting on my porch listening to frogs down by the water. Okay. He gets upset when I ask questions. Something in her voice bothered me. Fear. My mother was never fearful. Another night she called asking if property taxes could really increase that much in 1 year. I checked county records the next morning. They hadn't. That was the moment I started paying attention. But by then Mom's health was failing fast, and Daniel controlled almost everything around her, including access. The last Thanksgiving before she died still haunts me. Mom looked exhausted sitting at the dinner table. Dad barely spoke to me. Daniel spent the entire evening talking about how hard caregiving had been for him, like he was campaigning for sainthood. Then Mom reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Tiny gesture. Weak fingers, but deliberate. When I looked at her, she gave me this look I still can't explain properly. Almost like apology. Almost like warning. 3 months later, she was gone. And 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel filed the lawsuit. I remember sitting alone afterwards, staring at the Chesapeake water outside my window, thinking something I never thought I'd think about my own family. This lawsuit was never about money. It was punishment. Punishment for leaving. Punishment for succeeding somewhere they couldn't follow. Punishment for becoming someone my father never understood. And sitting there in that courtroom now, watching Daniel grin across the aisle while Dad silently approved, I realized something else. They truly believed I would stand there defenseless. They had no idea who I used to be. The silence inside that courtroom lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. Their attorney, Richard Talbot, slowly lowered the folder in his hands and stared at me across the room like he was trying to place a face from a nightmare. Judge Holloway noticed immediately. Mr. Talbot, he repeated. Talbot cleared his throat. Your Honor, I'd like a brief moment with my client. Daniel looked irritated. For what, she's bluffing. Talbot didn't even look at him. That was the first crack. Small, but visible. Judge Holloway studied me carefully over the rim of his glasses. He was probably around 70 himself. Silver hair, navy blue tie, calm voice, the kind of old-school judge who believed manners still mattered. 5 minutes, he said finally. The gavel tapped once. Everybody stood. The room exploded into whispers. I stayed seated. At my age, you learn there's no point rushing anywhere, especially not toward conflict. Daniel followed his attorney near the back wall, visibly annoyed. What is wrong with you? I heard him hiss. Talbot spoke so quietly I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the fear. And fear has a language of its own. My father remained seated on the wooden bench behind Daniel's table. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. Old age had finally caught him over the last couple years. For a moment he looked at me, not angrily, not warmly either, just uncertain. That may have hurt more than hatred, because uncertainty meant he no longer knew who I was. The truth is, most people never really knew what I did in the Navy. That was intentional. Even Frank, my husband, only knew pieces, not because I didn't trust him, because compartmentalization becomes second nature after enough years around classified systems. You stop talking automatically. You learn silence the way normal people learn small talk. Back in the early 1980s, when I first entered Naval Intelligence Logistics Support, I was mostly handling transportation authorizations, secure communications routing, and contractor documentation. Boring on paper. That's how government work usually looks from the outside. But over time, I moved into security compliance investigations involving defense contractors and overseas supply coordination during the Gulf War years. Nothing glamorous. No Hollywood nonsense. Mostly long nights, bad coffee, endless reports, and people lying about money. People think intelligence work is guns and car chases. Most of it is paperwork. Very dangerous paperwork. One missing signature can compromise an operation. One dishonest contractor can cost lives. I learned early that corruption rarely looks dramatic at first. Usually it starts with somebody quietly changing numbers nobody expects others to check. That lesson stayed with me long after retirement, including when I started noticing strange financial patterns around my mother's accounts. Talbot approached the bench after recess ended. His voice sounded tighter now. Your Honor, before proceeding, I would request clarification regarding the defendant's prior federal affiliations. Daniel groaned loudly. Oh, come on. Judge Holloway folded his hands. Ms. Whitaker. I opened my leather folder slowly and removed a sealed document packet. 20 years ago, those packets used to travel inside locked diplomatic cases. Now they mostly sat untouched in my filing cabinet beside old tax returns and insurance papers. Funny how ordinary classified history becomes after retirement. I handed the packet to the bailiff. The judge opened it carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. Not shock. Recognition. Professional recognition. The kind older servicemen sometimes give each other at airports without saying a word. Daniel looked around impatiently. What is this seriously? Nobody answered him. Judge Holloway continued reading silently for nearly a minute. The courtroom had become so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Finally, the judge looked up. Ms. Whitaker, he said carefully, you previously held federal clearance authorization connected to naval intelligence compliance operations. Yes, Your Honor. Until your retirement in 2018. Yes. Talbot looked physically uncomfortable now. Daniel laughed nervously. So what, she shuffled military paperwork for 30 years. The judge did not smile. And that bothered Daniel. You could see it. Because men like my brother survive on reading social signals. The second the room stops validating them, they panic. Dad shifted uneasily on the bench. His eyes moved between me and the judge, confusion spreading slowly across his face. I almost pitied him. Almost. The truth was, my father built an entire emotional version of me over 40 years. A selfish daughter who left home chasing career ambitions. A woman who chose government work over family dinners. A sister who disappeared during birthdays and anniversaries because work came first. He never understood that missing holidays wasn't ambition. It was duty. Sometimes we were activated without notice. Sometimes travel restrictions prevented communication. Sometimes operations overseas became unstable overnight. You learn not to explain. You simply go. And eventually people stop asking where you've been. Frank understood better than anyone. He was Coast Guard before becoming a civilian harbor inspector. Quiet man, good man. We met in Norfolk in 1987. He once told me people only understand sacrifice when they can see it. That stayed with me. Because invisible sacrifice confuses people, especially family. Talbot finally cleared his throat again. Your Honor, my firm had prior indirect interaction with an investigation tied to Miss Whitaker's office during a contractor audit in 1994. Daniel blinked. What does that mean? Talbot hesitated. It means I recognize her credentials. For the first time all morning, Daniel stopped looking confident. Not scared yet, but unsettled. Judge Holloway leaned back slowly. Interesting. I could feel eyes all over the courtroom now. Curiosity replacing mockery. But I didn't feel triumphant. That's the strange thing people misunderstand about revenge. Real revenge rarely feels exciting. Mostly it feels exhausting. Especially when family is involved. The judge reopened the inheritance file. Now he said calmly, let us continue regarding the allegations of financial manipulation against Ms. Whitaker. Daniel straightened quickly, eager to regain control. Yes, Your Honor. My mother was confused near the end. My sister isolated her and pressured her into changing the will. I looked directly at my brother. When exactly did Mom become confused, Daniel? He frowned. What? You said she was mentally compromised. She was. I nodded slowly. Then why did you allow her to sign 3 separate refinancing documents 6 months earlier? The room went still again. Daniel's face tightened instantly. Tiny reaction, but enough. Talbot closed his eyes briefly like a man realizing the floor beneath him might collapse. Dad looked confused. Refinancing, he muttered softly. Daniel turned around too fast. Dad, don't worry about that. But now Judge Holloway was paying very close attention. What refinancing documents, he asked. I opened another folder, and that was the moment I realized something important. Daniel came into this courtroom expecting humiliation. He never expected resistance. Worse, he never expected documentation. Judge Holloway removed his glasses slowly. What refinancing documents? I slid the papers across the table toward the bailiff. The courtroom had changed completely now. Earlier people looked at me like I was some lonely widow about to lose everything. Now nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even Daniel noticed it. And he hated it. These documents, I said, calmly show that 6 months before my mother passed away, my brother helped her refinance a portion of the family property. Dad frowned from the gallery bench. Refinance. Daniel turned immediately. It was temporary, Dad. But his voice cracked slightly. That tiny crack told me everything. Judge Holloway studied the paperwork carefully. Mr. Whitaker, he said, these forms carry your mother's signature. Yes, Daniel answered quickly. She agreed to it. I folded my hands together. Then, she was mentally competent enough to sign loan agreements worth over $200,000. Daniel's mouth opened, closed again. Talbot looked physically ill now. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because Richard Talbot wasn't the villain here. He was a lawyer who walked into court believing he represented a bitter inheritance dispute between siblings. Instead, he'd discovered he might be sitting beside financial fraud. There's a difference. A dangerous one. Dad leaned forward slowly. What loan? Daniel's irritation flared immediately. Dad, I told you already it was for the business. What business? Judge Holloway asked. Daniel hesitated. The marina expansion. I nearly smiled. There never was a marina expansion. Just another failed investment Daniel tried hiding from the family. Over the years, my brother cycled through business ideas the way some people cycle through diets. Boat repair, landscaping, vending machines, used RV sales. Every single one collapsed under debt. And every collapse somehow became somebody else's fault. Bad economy, bad partners, bad timing. Never Daniel. Never his gambling. Never the quiet loans. Never the missing money. Mom covered for him most of her life because she couldn't bear conflict. Dad covered for him because he believed sons deserved second chances longer than daughters did. But age changes things, especially desperation. I looked at the judge again. Your Honor, I'd also like entered into evidence county tax payment records for the property over the last 4 years. Talbot rubbed his forehead hard. Daniel muttered, "Oh my God." The bailiff handed the documents to Judge Holloway. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. These payments came from your personal account, Ms. Whitaker. Yes. Dad stared at me. You paid the taxes. I nodded once. Daniel jumped in immediately. She only did that to manipulate Mom. I turned toward him slowly. No, Daniel. I did it because the county was preparing lien notices. That landed hard. Dad's face strained. What? The old man looked genuinely shaken now. I hated seeing it. No matter how angry I'd been over the years, he was still my father. And old age makes betrayal look crueler somehow, especially when confusion enters the picture. Judge Holloway's tone sharpened. Mr. Whitaker, was your father aware the property faced tax delinquency concerns? Daniel avoided eye contact. It wasn't serious. But it had been serious. Very serious. I remembered the exact night I discovered it. Mom had called me around 11:30. Her voice sounded weak. Nervous. Margaret, she whispered, could you check something for me? I sat up immediately in bed. What's wrong? I found a letter from the county. The next morning I drove 2 hours to Fairfax and went straight to the records office. That's when I learned portions of the property taxes had gone unpaid for nearly 18 months. Not because Mom forgot. Because somebody redirected money. I knew immediately who that somebody was, but proving it quietly without humiliating Dad became the problem. So I paid the overdue amount myself. Nearly $16,000. I never told anyone. Not even Frank's old friends from the Coast Guard support group I occasionally met for coffee. You know something strange about getting older. You stop keeping score. At least healthy people do. You help because somebody has to. That's all. The courtroom door opened quietly as a clerk brought additional files to the judge's bench. Outside the windows, gray November rain streaked across the courthouse parking lot. Everything suddenly felt smaller, older, sadder. Judge Holloway reviewed the records for several long moments before looking toward Daniel again. Mr. Whitaker, he said carefully, did your mother personally authorize these financial transfers? Yes. Do you possess documentation beyond your own submitted statements? Daniel swallowed. Talbot finally spoke up. Your Honor, my client may require time to organize supplementary records. That was lawyer language for we have a problem. A serious one. Dad looked back and forth between us like a man waking from anesthesia. Slowly, painfully. I don't understand, he murmured. And right then I realized something terrible. Dad truly didn't know. For months I'd convinced myself he knowingly helped Daniel turn against me. But sitting there watching confusion spread across his face, I saw something different. Loneliness. Old age terrifies people in ways younger folks don't fully understand. Once your spouse dies, the world becomes unstable. You start depending on whoever stays closest. Daniel understood that, and he used it. He became Dad's driver, Dad's helper, Dad's daily company. Not because he loved responsibility, because proximity creates influence, especially with elderly parents. The judge looked toward me again. Ms. Whitaker, do you possess further evidence regarding financial irregularities? I hesitated briefly, then opened the final folder. Inside was a handwritten letter. Mom's handwriting. Weak but recognizable. The second Dad saw the envelope, his breathing changed. Oh no, he whispered. Daniel's face hardened immediately. Where did you get that? Mom had mailed it to me 3 weeks before she died. Certified mail. No return address. Inside was only one handwritten sentence on the front page. If anything happens, read this in court. I'd carried that letter in my bag for months without opening it again. Partly because I already knew what it contained. Partly because I was afraid hearing Mom's voice one last time might break something inside me I couldn't repair. Judge Holloway accepted the envelope carefully. Is this relevant to the financial allegations? I looked toward my father, then my brother, then finally the judge. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel stood suddenly. That letter shouldn't be admitted. The room froze. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. And why is that, Mr. Whitaker? For the first time all day? Daniel looked afraid. Daniel remained standing. That letter shouldn't be admitted. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Judge Holloway folded his hands slowly. And why exactly would that be, Mr. Whitaker? Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. Talbot quietly touched his sleeve. Sit down, the attorney whispered. Daniel ignored him. That letter was written while my mother was confused. The judge glanced toward me. Ms. Whitaker, I answered calmly. My mother mailed it certified 3 weeks before her death. The judge examined the envelope carefully. The certification stamp was still visible near the corner. Dated. Verified. Real. Talbot finally spoke in a tired voice. Your Honor, perhaps we should review the contents privately before reading anything into public record. That alone told me everything. Richard Talbot no longer trusted his own client. Judge Holloway nodded once. I agree. He opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside looked fragile with age and handling. I recognized Mom's stationery immediately. Pale blue flowers around the edges. She'd used those letters for years. Christmas notes, birthday cards, recipes nobody in the family bothered learning properly. Funny what survives people. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading silently. At first his expression stayed neutral. Then slowly, it changed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just heavy, like a man carrying unexpected weight. Dad noticed too. What does it say? He asked quietly. Judge Holloway looked up. Mr. Whitaker, I believe this letter concerns all parties involved. I intend to admit it into record. Daniel's face tightened. You can't seriously. I can, the judge interrupted calmly. That shut him up. The courtroom air felt different now. Earlier there had been tension. Now there was dread. Judge Holloway began reading aloud. To whoever reads this, if Margaret brings this letter to court one day, it means things became worse than I feared. Dad lowered his head slowly. I felt my chest tighten hearing Mom's words again. Her voice returned instantly inside my memory. Soft Virginia accent, careful pacing, gentle even when angry. The judge continued, Daniel has been handling more of our finances since my health declined. I wanted to believe he was helping. But over time I became frightened to ask questions. Daniel stared at the table. Talbot closed his eyes briefly. I discovered money missing from accounts your father knew nothing about. When I confronted Daniel, he became angry and blamed stress from business troubles. Dad looked at his son. What is she talking about? Daniel didn't answer. The judge kept reading. I should have addressed this sooner, but after 58 years of marriage, I know your father. He avoids conflict when it involves family, especially Daniel. That one hit hard. Because it was true. Dad had spent his entire life pretending problems disappeared if ignored long enough. Sometimes that works with neighbors, not with children. Judge Holloway's voice softened slightly as he continued. Margaret may seem distant to people who don't understand her life, but distance is not abandonment. I swallowed carefully. The room remained completely still. Her work required silence. More silence than most families could tolerate. But she served this country honorably for decades while expecting nothing in return from any of us. Dad's hands began trembling. She missed holidays because duty called her away. She missed birthdays because other families needed their sons and daughters protected too. I looked down at my folded coat resting beside me. Suddenly I remembered another courtroom. Different year, different building. A military contractor hearing involving missing navigation equipment during the Gulf War buildup. 3 straight days awake. 2 sailors nearly killed because somebody altered procurement records. That investigation changed my career permanently. But while I sat in secure rooms halfway across the world, my family back home simply thought Margaret skipped Thanksgiving again. Invisible sacrifice. Frank was right. People rarely understand what they cannot see. The judge continued reading Mom's letter. I am writing this because I fear resentment has poisoned my family. Your father never forgave Margaret for leaving home. Daniel quietly learned to use that pain. Dad suddenly covered his mouth with one shaking hand. The old man looked destroyed, not angry. Destroyed. And for the first time since Mom died, my own anger weakened a little. Because grief changes elderly people differently. Younger people burn hot. Older people collapse inward. Judge Holloway paused before reading the next section. I also need the truth known clearly. Margaret secretly paid overdue taxes on this property after Daniel failed to do so. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Dad stared directly at Daniel now. You told me taxes were handled. Daniel snapped immediately. I was trying to fix it. With what money, I asked quietly. He glared at me, and suddenly I saw it. Not arrogance, panic. Pure panic. People like Daniel survive through momentum. As long as nobody stops them, they keep spinning stories faster than others can question them. But once truth enters the room, everything collapses quickly. Judge Holloway resumed reading. I love both my children, but love without honesty destroys families slowly. Daniel needs help, not excuses. That line broke something inside Dad. He bent forward suddenly, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. I had not seen my father cry since his own father died in 1972. Not at funerals, not after heart surgery, not even after Mom passed. But now quiet tears slipped through his fingers inside that courtroom. Nobody looked away. Even Daniel seemed shaken seeing it. The judge finished the final paragraph softly. If this family still has a chance after I am gone, it will only happen when truth becomes more important than pride. Silence filled the room again. Heavy silence. The kind older people understand well. The silence after hospitals, after funerals, after marriages fail quietly. Judge Holloway folded the letter carefully and removed his glasses. Dad finally looked up at me. His eyes were red. I didn't know he whispered. 3 simple words. But after 40 years of distance, they felt enormous. Daniel stood abruptly. She manipulated Mom into writing that. But even he sounded uncertain now. Talbot spoke before anyone else could. Daniel, stop talking. No, Mr. Whitaker. No professional distance anymore. Just exhausted honesty. Daniel stared at his own attorney in disbelief. What? Talbot rubbed his face slowly. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. You never told me about the taxes. Daniel said nothing. You never told me about refinancing against the property either. Still silence. And you definitely never mentioned a handwritten statement from your mother warning about financial misconduct. Dad looked at Daniel like he no longer recognized him. The old man's entire body seemed smaller somehow. Fragile. Judge Holloway leaned forward carefully. Mr. Whitaker, I strongly advise complete honesty from this point forward. Daniel finally looked at me. Not smug, not superior, just cornered. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, my brother looked afraid of me. Daniel looked trapped. That was the only word for it. Not angry anymore. Not confident. Trapped. The courtroom that had once felt so comfortably under his control had turned into something dangerous. Every pair of eyes now watched him the same way people watch a bridge after hearing the first crack. Carefully, cautiously. Judge Holloway folded his hands together. Mr. Whitaker, he said calmly, this court is now concerned about possible financial misrepresentation involving estate assets and property liabilities. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. You're blowing this out of proportion. Talbot gave a dry laugh under his breath. That surprised even me, because lawyers like Richard Talbot usually protected appearances until the bitter end. But not anymore. Not once he realized he'd been dragged into something ugly. Daniel Talbot said quietly, "Stop treating this like an argument at a family barbecue." My brother stared at him. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I'm your attorney," Talbot replied, "not your accomplice." That landed hard. Dad looked physically sick. The old man's hands trembled against the wooden bench beside him. Suddenly he looked every bit of his 86 years. I hated that part most. Not the lawsuit. Not the humiliation. Watching age collide with betrayal. There's something deeply cruel about elderly people discovering the people they trusted most have lied to them, especially when grief already weakened them first. Judge Holloway turned toward Daniel again. "I'll ask directly. Did you use portions of the family property as collateral for personal business debt without fully informing your father?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It was temporary." "That is not the question." Silence. Finally, "Yes." Dad inhaled sharply, like someone punched him. The judge continued. "Did your mother express concerns regarding missing funds before her death?" Daniel looked toward the ceiling briefly, then nodded once. "Yes." Dad whispered, "Oh my God." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not from satisfaction. From exhaustion. Because the truth is, I never wanted this moment. People imagine revenge feels triumphant. Most of the time it just feels sad, especially inside families. Judge Holloway's voice remained steady. "And did you knowingly allow this court to proceed under allegations that your sister manipulated your mother financially?" Daniel snapped immediately. "She did manipulate her." "How?" "She turned Mom against me." There it was. Not money. Not inheritance. The real wound. Judge Holloway leaned back slightly. "How exactly?" Daniel looked at me for the first time in several minutes, and suddenly years of bitterness came pouring out of him. "She always acted better than everyone else." I said nothing. She leaves town, joins the military, disappears for decades, and suddenly everybody treats her like some hero. Dad looked stunned hearing him say it aloud. But I wasn't surprised. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. Daniel stood slowly, his voice cracked now with something deeper than anger. You know what it was like growing up here after she left? Nobody answered. She got letters from officers and commanders and government people. Mom framed her Navy photos in the hallway like she was some celebrity. His breathing became uneven. And me, he laughed bitterly. I was just the son who stayed home. Talbot watched silently. Even the judge allowed him to continue. Because sometimes courts accidentally become confessionals. Daniel pointed toward me. She comes home after years away and everybody suddenly forgets who actually took care of Mom and Dad. You stole from them, I said quietly. That stopped him cold. His face twisted instantly. I borrowed money. You refinanced their property behind Dad's back. I was trying to save the business. What business? I asked calmly. The marina that never existed. The room fell silent again. Dad looked at Daniel with genuine confusion now. There was no marina. Daniel avoided his eyes. That hurt the old man worse than anything else. You could see it happen, not because of the money, because parents can survive disappointment easier than humiliation. And suddenly Dad realized he'd defended lies publicly. Judge Holloway reviewed several papers before speaking again. Mr. Whitaker, based on current evidence, this court finds no support for your allegations against your sister. However, substantial concerns now exist regarding your own conduct. Daniel sat heavily in his chair, defeated. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked small. Not evil, not monstrous. Just broken in ordinary human ways. That's the thing people eventually learn about family conflict. Most villains are simply wounded people who chose bitterness too long. Judge Holloway continued. I am referring portions of these financial findings for additional civil review. Dad lowered his head again. Daniel looked terrified now. Wait. But the judge raised one hand. However, everybody looked up. I also recognize this matter involves significant family grief, elder dependency concerns, and long-standing emotional conflict. The judge looked toward me. Ms. Whitaker, do you wish to pursue maximum civil penalties available under the current evidence? The courtroom became perfectly still. Talbot looked surprised. Daniel looked terrified. Dad looked ashamed. And me, I looked at my brother. Really looked at him. Past the arrogance. Past the lies. Past the resentment. I saw the little boy who used to wait on the front porch for me after school because bullies picked on him in 5th grade. I saw the teenager who cried privately after our dog died. I saw the man who never truly became comfortable in his own skin after spending his whole life comparing himself to someone else. Bitterness had rotted him slowly. But underneath it, he was still family. I took a slow breath. Then I answered, No, Your Honor. Daniel blinked. Talbot stared at me. Even Judge Holloway looked surprised. I folded my hands quietly. My mother wanted the truth known, I said, not destruction. Dad started crying again, openly this time. No attempt to hide it. The sound nearly broke my heart. Daniel looked at me with total confusion. Why would you do that? He whispered. Because despite everything, I was tired. Tired of funerals, tired of resentment, tired of old wounds surviving longer than love. I looked at him steadily. Because somebody in this family needs to stop the bleeding. Nobody spoke after that. Not for a long time. Then finally Daniel lowered his eyes, and for the first time since childhood, my brother could not look me in the face. 3 weeks after the court hearing, the Chesapeake Bay finally started looking like winter. The water outside my house turned gray and restless. Wind pushed dead leaves across the porch every morning, and the air smelled like cold salt and wood smoke drifting from neighboring homes. Life became quiet again. The lawsuit ended faster than most people expected. Daniel withdrew the remaining claims after his attorney negotiated revised financial disclosures with the county. Judge Holloway's findings stayed on record, but because I refused harsher penalties, the matter avoided turning into criminal prosecution. That decision confused many people, including Daniel, including myself sometimes, but at my age, peace starts mattering more than victory, especially after funerals, especially after losing almost everyone who once knew you young. I spent most mornings sitting near the bay with coffee and old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Photos from Norfolk, photos from Gulf deployments, photos of Frank standing beside Coast Guard vessels with that crooked grin I still missed every day. One morning I found an old picture of myself in uniform from 1993. Sharp posture, dark hair, eyes that still believed hard work could fix everything. I stared at it for a long time, then laughed quietly to myself. That woman had no idea how lonely service could become later in life. People thank veterans in airports now, that's kind. But they rarely understand the invisible part afterward. The missed birthdays, the emotional distance, the marriages that survive through sacrifice, the families that quietly drift away while duty keeps pulling you somewhere else. Service leaves marks nobody sees, and silence leaves marks too. Around noon that same day, somebody knocked on my front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Dad. He stood there wearing his old brown jacket and holding a grocery bag for absolutely no reason except nervousness. Old men from his generation always needed something in their hands during emotional moments. Thought maybe you needed soup, he muttered. I stepped aside quietly. Come in. He moved slower than I remembered. The courtroom seemed to age him 10 years in one afternoon. Or maybe truth simply removes the last illusions people use to stay young. We sat at the kitchen table overlooking the bay. For nearly 2 full minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Dad looked out the window and sighed. Your mother loved this view. Yes. Another silence. Then I was hard on you. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just honest. I stirred my coffee slowly. You were. Dad nodded weakly. I thought if you left home, eventually you'd forget us. That hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly so many old arguments finally made sense. Not anger. Fear. Parents from his generation rarely admitted fear directly, especially fathers. Instead, it came out sideways. Criticism. Distance. Pride. I never forgot, I said quietly. Dad rubbed his arthritic hands together. I know that now. The old man looked around my kitchen carefully. Framed photos, navy plaques packed away quietly near the bookshelf. Frank's old Coast Guard cap hanging beside the door. You really did all that stuff, he asked softly. I almost smiled. What stuff? All those years overseas, security work, investigations. A little. Dad shook his head slowly. You never talked about it. I wasn't supposed to. Another long silence settled between us. But this one felt gentler. Healing silence. Not hostile silence. Finally, Dad asked something he'd never asked me in 40 years. Were you scared? I looked down at my coffee cup. Sometimes. Not during emergencies. Not during investigations. Oddly enough, training handles those moments. The fear comes later. Hotels alone at night. Phone calls you can't return. Watching young sailors pretend they aren't terrified before deployment. And funerals. So many funerals. Yes, I answered honestly, sometimes. Dad nodded slowly like he was finally meeting his daughter for the first time. I'm sorry, he whispered. Simple words. Late words. But real. At our age, real matters more than perfect. The knock at the door came unexpectedly around 20 minutes later. Dad looked confused. I didn't bring anybody. I stood and opened the door slowly. Daniel stood outside, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. The courtroom had stripped something out of him too. For a moment nobody spoke. Then he looked at Dad. I almost drove away 3 times. Dad gave a tired half laugh. Probably should've. Daniel nodded slightly. Maybe. I stepped aside. Come in. The 3 of us sat awkwardly around the kitchen table like strangers trapped together during a snowstorm, which honestly described most families after enough years pass. Daniel stared down at his hands. I messed everything up. Nobody interrupted him. That business debt got worse than I told anybody. He swallowed hard. After Mom got sick. I panicked. Dad closed his eyes painfully. You lied to me. I know. You stole from us. Daniel nodded once. I know. Then finally he looked at me. I hated you for leaving. The honesty in his voice surprised me. I know, I said quietly. You always seemed stronger than me. I almost laughed at that. Because strength is one of the biggest misunderstandings in American families. People think strength means confidence. Sometimes strength is simply enduring loneliness without becoming cruel. Daniel rubbed his face. When people talked about you, it made me feel small. I studied him carefully. Not the angry brother from court, not the manipulative son. Just an aging man carrying decades of insecurity badly. And suddenly I felt tired of punishing him in my own mind. Dad slowly stood from the table and wandered toward the hallway. My old navy coat still hung beside the closet door where I'd left it earlier that morning. The room became quiet again as he stared at it. Then something happened I never expected. Dad straightened his posture carefully despite the arthritis, raised his trembling hand, and gave me the first salute of my life. I couldn't speak. Neither could Daniel. The old man's eyes filled with tears. I should have done that years ago, he whispered. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then finally I stood and hugged my father. And after a moment, my brother too. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Some damage never disappears completely. But healing begins the moment pride stops speaking louder than love. And maybe that's the real tragedy of growing older. Not wrinkles. Not illness. not even death. It's realizing how many years people waste misunderstanding each other. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of somebody you still need to call forgive or simply understand a little better, then maybe it was worth telling. And if you believe quiet strength still matters in this world, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this.